Hi there. My name is Max Fawcett, and I'm the lead columnist with Canada's National Observer. My guest today on Power Lines is Margareta Dovgal, the managing director of ResourceWorks, a pro-natural resources organization headquartered in BC. She wrote a fascinating column for the National Post recently that I want to really dig into, along with some broader conversation about energy policy in Canada. Now, full disclosure, Margareta and I are not complete strangers. We both volunteered on the same federal political campaign in 2019 when my friend Talib Noor Mohammed ran for the Liberals in Vancouver Centre. He lost, but I don't think that was due to anything either one of us did. But we both share an interest in good energy policy, and that's what we'll discuss today. So, Margareta, welcome.
Thanks so much, Max. Great to be on with you here.
So let's start with the headline. And I know writers don't always write their headlines. I certainly don't, but it is an eye catcher. It says the cost of Carney's energy sector sabotage is staggering. This framing is basically the opposite of how a lot of my readers and a lot of this show's listeners are seeing things right now. They see Carney as aiding and abetting the energy sector, not sabotaging it. So can you lay out your thesis here?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're completely correct to intuit that's typically the writers don't pick their own headlines, particularly for op-eds. It depends a little bit on the substance of it, but yeah, in this case, that was not the frame that I put into it at the start. I think in a functional sense, though, there's always a push and pull. Whenever an issue, let's say, even has two poles to it, sometimes you have more complex issues, but in energy and climate, uh, no one is always going to be perfectly happy with how governments are doing something, and that doesn't necessarily mean that one camp is correct and the other one is wrong. I think it's just how you frame your priorities. So if your priority is to see the energy sector shut down, and I imagine some of your listeners have that priority. Sure, Carney's not doing a good job in that respect. If your priority is to see Canada's energy sector meet its full potential and actually go pedal to the metal, exporting products to the world, lifting the quality of life for Canadians by exporting commodities that the world needs, which is something that I am quite passionate about, then I think there's reasonable critiques you can also make of Carney from that perspective. So I think from both angles, if you frame the question in a certain way, you can get a certain answer.
I will get into the pedal to the metal approach, I think, a little later because I have um, some issues with that, not strictly just in terms of the goal, but the viability of that goal in Canada. But I want to start with the column, start at the start. You open with some words from John McKenzie, the CEO of Cenovus. He's kind of become the de facto spokesperson for the oil sands companies and their criticism of the government's remaining climate policies, and he's been particularly critical of the industrial carbon tax. Um, I want to play a little game here. Cenovus doesn't report the cost of the industrial carbon tax and its regulatory findings, which I think is interesting. But would you care to guess at the company's per barrel compliance costs in 2025?
If you're going to tell me it's the cost of a Timbit, I'm going to have to uh, laugh because I think that's what you're about to tell me. I've heard that one
Nope,
before.
nope, it's
No,
not.
what is it then per barrel? Hmm.
Again, we don't know because they don't report them, but there was a very interesting chart that was put out a few days ago that sort of broke down the various oil sands facilities in Canada and whether, what they pay in industrial carbon tax versus what they get in credits. And all of Cenovus's projects, major projects, Christina Lake, Foster Creek, are in a credit position. So I think
Yeah.
it's very likely that Cenovus generates revenue from the industrial carbon tax. How do you square that with the CEO's comments and the way he's talked about it?
So I'm really glad you asked that question because I talk to a lot of really smart economists, number crunchers at companies. I just like reach out to them and say, hey, I want to pick your brain because I know you do the modeling that goes into GR submissions, and I want to understand like what the logic behind it. Because I understand quantitative analysis. I don't actually do deep quantitative analysis. I kind of work with the stuff that I have the skills to do, but I'm not an economist, and I don't have a bachelor's in math, but some of these guys do. And it's clear to me that different companies are in different positions based on the type of assets that they have and the type of technology stack that they use at their facilities. So, you get really broad range of scenarios for emissions intensity, scenarios for cost of compliance with things like OBPS, the output-based pricing system. So it doesn't surprise me. I'm not so familiar with Cenovus's operations. I, haven't looked at the figures you've cited. I don't think I've actually spoken to their team on that one either, in fairness, but I'm familiar with like Christine Lake, for example. It's cited as, a very high-tech facility. And I hear this theme repeated often in conversations with those in industry that the impacts from different regulatory systems are felt differently across the sector for the reasons that I've outlined. What I think, and I'm speculating here, I think when a person like John McKenzie is speaking about competitiveness impacts, he's not just speaking about his company and their investments. I think he's speaking about what other CEOs are observing through their operations and the overall competitiveness case for further investment. So, that could mean existing assets, that could mean new assets. So that's sort of where I think the logic is on that. That sure, maybe they are in that scenario, but I think the broader comment is about the sector as a whole and its ability to actually attract the capital needed to grow it, grow production, and grow exports, so we can start to see more incomes come in.
Did you see the recent study that the Fraser Institute published by Jack Mintz?
Which one?
So it was about the industrial carbon tax and its impact on competitiveness.
I'm sure I've seen it cited. I don't think I've looked at the study specifically, but please tell me what you've seen.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. It's been framed as proof that, the industrial carbon tax is an absolute killer for competitiveness. It significantly raises costs. And then you go into the actual meat of it. You look past the headline. You look into the sort of the guts of the study. And what Jack Mintz found was that even with the, dreaded industrial carbon tax, Canada is a more attractive jurisdiction for oil investment than Texas, and will be for years to come, even as the carbon price rises. And the fully expressed carbon price under the MOU with Alberta, Mintz models it as adding $3 per barrel of cost. That's higher than a lot of other estimates, but it's not that much of an addition in terms of costs when the price of oil can bounce around $10, $15 a barrel in a given year. So how do you reconcile the data around the impact of the industrial carbon price with the rhetoric? Are these companies on a razor's edge of competitiveness and they just can't absorb a couple dollars per barrel of cost, or are they maybe not shooting from the hip on how damaging this climate policy is?
Yeah, I think a lot of problems that affect competitiveness do as a short form get lumped under carbon pricing. It's not just carbon pricing. Peter Terzakian, who's a really brilliant guy, worked in the energy sector for decades, does a lot of cool things, a podcast like yourself, and interviews guests, and tries to sort of synthesize all the wisdom and understanding in business sense that comes out of Calgary. He often refers to it as pancaking. So we have a lot of pancaking. There's regulatory complexity. It's not just carbon pricing. Carbon pricing has gone through a couple of evolutions. We've seen carbon pricing actually absorb, well, because the consumer carbon price proved politically unsustainable. And that's something that's, I remember economists in the mid 2010s warning us about that. I was in university, and then I was in grad school, and I remember reading stuff out of SFU. I forget the guy's name now. And there was just sort of analysis of different carbon emissions mitigation tools. And this SFU guy said, oh, the public's going to hate this, and this is totally a no-go. Being a federal liberal at the time, I was really married to the idea of a carbon price. And I was like, but this is amazing. Like, we need more carbon pricing. This is like the most efficient tool. We found that to actually not be so popular and so effective. And there was that big pivot before the last federal election. So we've actually seen the industrial carbon price evolve as a tool to absorb the emissions reductions hopes of government. So it's carrying more weight now. And then to my point about Terzakian, there's a lot of other competitiveness impacts. But I'll maybe wrap up my answer with one sort of key thing that I come back to. I often run this exercise when I'm picking the brains of people who do the quantitative analysis as their day job. I actually ask them just to like stress test their position. If it wasn't for this, like, would we be in a competitive position? Like, I try to essentially ask the question you're asking, like, is this really a competitive impact for you? Or are we just complaining because, it would be nice to have a little bit more profit. And I asked that question in a variety of ways. I asked of people I've spent years, regularly corresponding with and pick up the phone and calling them when I have a technical question. I've also asked of people I've recently met. The answer is pretty consistent, and I don't have any reason to believe these people are lying to me. I haven't seen analysis that suggests that the concerns that energy producers in Canada have around competitiveness are made up concerns. They're not made up concerns. But to your point, it's not, razor thin margins. It's the sort of not always fully rational logic of investment decisions, because investment decisions are not purely quantitative. There's a risk component to it, and you can quantify the risk, but it's a little bit of everything. So it's about whether you expect something's going to be profitable. It's about whether you expect you're going to get predictability and certainty in the operating environment over the period of your investment. And it's about whether you think that there's a risk that the whole thing is just going to, rug's going to get pulled out from under you, especially if major projects are involved in your overall business case. And I think in the combination of those things, carbon pricing is one of the things that adds to that competitiveness challenge. And we see it directed in how energy companies move capital. So when the oil price crashed in 2015, we didn't see the rebound that I think we would have seen, because we started to see new climate policies start to get layered on. And instead of reinvesting, companies started to push dividends to shareholders instead. So anyways, that's a long answer, but I hope that answers the substance of what you're asking about.
Sure, I'm going to push back there, but I just want
Yeah.
to circle back on the SFU guy. I think you're referring to Mark Chicard.
Yes, Jakar,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay.
Couldn't,
Yeah.
yeah,
And
recall the name.
I wrote something, a blog post, some sort of communication, basically saying, when the consumer carbon price was removed, he was right. He was right
Yeah,
all along.
yeah, that's
That
right.
that
Yep.
doing it through regulations was the politically viable way to go, and I think lesson learned by certainly the current government on the the rebound that we would have seen if let's say there was a conservative government that had won in 2015. We always compare shale to, and this is going to get wonky for some people, so buckle up. We compare shale to oil sands, right? And we say, well, look at all this money that flowed into shale, post 2016, 2017, and it didn't flow into oil sands. Obviously, the federal government's policies are to blame. But if you look at deep water offshore drilling, which is sort of a similar project to the oil sands in terms of long cycle, capital takes a while to get paid back, higher cost for greenfield projects. The money never came back for deep water. It all went into shale because shale was that short cycle. You get your return within, call it 18 months. It was much better fit for a lower oil price environment than those longer cycle investments. So are we sure that the rebound or the absence of a rebound was due to federal policies, or was it due to the sort of inherent nature of an oil sands project and the way it has to be structured and paid out?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking the question. I think it's an important one to ask for anyone who's involved in any kind of industry related advocacy. Like, I don't represent industry. I don't, I'm not a lobbyist for industry. I set an independent research agenda, and then, completely candidly, I go out and I fundraise around it. I also go and run events and, try to do everything I can to, do the kinds of projects that I'm passionate about. And I still ask myself that question though, because I obviously understand that I'm seen as an industry voice, and I think it's important to know when something is independently real, or if it's real because a community of people who you trust and you work with believe it's real. And I've interrogated precisely the competitiveness issues that I see in Canada from that lens, because I think it's important to do so with the spirit of like intellectual honesty. And if you're not asking yourself, I don't know if you're lobbying for manufacturing, and asking yourself, like, is the story that I tell myself and that my industry tells myself really the real one relative to other peer competitors, relative to alternative policy environments, or is it just a convenient story that is useful for my lobbying objectives? And I've come out of that process repeatedly, pretty rigorously, convinced that yeah, we are losing out on investment that would actually be going into Canada, and we see it within jurisdictions in Canada. So BC's compliance environment has gotten a little bit tougher. The Alberta MOU actually has created some carve-outs for Alberta from federal stuff. So for a variety of reasons, both provincial rules and also federal carve-outs in relation to the MOU, we see that exact logic play out. So if you're following me here,
Mhm.
capital that would otherwise be invested in BC is not going to BC. It's actually going to Alberta for companies that have operations between the two provinces. And I've heard that verbatim from companies that are in that position. There's a lot of them. So, I'm not breaking any rules telling you who
Yep.
that would be. And a lot of them have told me that. So that's the same kind of logic we see play out among companies that have operations in other countries, not just in Canada. They are diverting not just to your point to new cycles and new technologies, but comparable assets, producing comparable things. And I think that's also seen in where investment isn't going generally. So it's how do I put it? I guess if you're talking about like individual investors as units of analysis rather than the sector as a whole, I think that analysis stands. To your point, though, like could that money that investors are getting back in dividends potentially be going to other types of energy investment? Possible, but I still think there's a lot of investment that is missing that's not coming through that would otherwise be coming through if we didn't have that pancaking of difficult, sometimes contradictory federal and provincial rules that make it difficult for the energy sector to fully leverage the interest that exists in our product and the export demand for the products that we produce and we can sell.
I don't, we don't disagree on the fact that there is some amount of investment that is discouraged by the existence of climate policies versus the absence of climate policies. Like we can disagree on, sort of the moral and ethical nature of that, but just, as a fact, I agree with that. Where we disagree is the quantum of that. And you have seen, I have seen, everyone has seen people blaming federal climate policies, the Trudeau government, for all of the projects that didn't get built once the price of oil and once the price of landed LNG in Asia crashed. And I think the fundamental disagreement is I would probably put the quantum of investment deterred by federal policies at like 5%. And I think some people put it at 100%. There's this funny chart. It's not ha funny. It's more sad funny that is constantly being circulated on LinkedIn, on Twitter, conservative corners of social media. That it's a chart of Canada's business investment levels, which dropped off a cliff in 2014, and it has a picture of Justin Trudeau's head right at the apex of the cliff. And sort of the suggestion is he's obviously responsible for all of the decline. The problem with that is that he wasn't elected until late 2015. And if you actually put his little head correctly on the chart, it's actually almost in the trough of the collapse in investment. So how do you explain that collapse in business investment that began in 2014?
Yeah, well, I mean, uh, many ways to unpack that question. Yeah, I think the first one for me is that Canada was a petrol currency, and we've actually seen a decoupling. So we're not really. I'm working on a piece right now, also from National Post, essentially like going through this. So I've been really deep in like the econ on it, and I've done some analysis in the past on the carbon pricing and competitiveness impacts. So I've looked at the numbers. I've looked at there's it's not monocausal. You can't just blame federal policy. I think you see similar productivity issues. You see similar capital investment issues in other parts of the economy. I you mentioned the federal campaign we both volunteered for in 2019. That's when I was a federal liberal. I actually became a federal conservative. I left the liberals. Um, I did so for a variety of reasons, and I know you didn't ask me this question, but my reasoning through the question you did ask is part of why I decided to leave. I felt that we have so many problems structurally as a country, and there is very much like a contingent of everything is great. And oddly, that everything is great contingent lately has also become the elbows up contingent that now is saying, oh, all our problems are really to do with Trump and our relationship with the US. I think there's a tendency to likewise on the opposite end of the political spectrum sometimes ascribe blame exclusively to whoever's in Ottawa, and in this case liberals have been in power for a long time. I think that's silly. Like we have structural issues that obviously have been around throughout a variety of different governments sitting there in Ottawa. But I do think that to your point about the quantum, like which percentage of the problems that we appear to possibly have, to your point, and investability in Canada come from things like carbon pricing versus, market trends, failures. That's the substance of the op-ed that I wrote that you're referencing. Um, I don't think the answer has to be 100. If your goal is to see that energy sector fully leveraged economically so that you can see benefits for Canadians, the answer doesn't have to be 100% of it is policy that we set up and competitively, even if the answer is five, which I don't think is realistic. I think it's closer to like 60, 70% in my candid opinion. I think you have a responsibility to ask yourself, well, if I want to give it the best odds of success relative to all the other options out there, why don't I set this more competitively? And then you get into a conversation about trade-offs. So I don't think necessarily that you have to come out of, it's exclusively the fault of Trudeau. The two don't flow from each other. And I think we don't need to be lazy with our analysis to come to the conclusion that a lot of the things that I think are hurting our ability to fully get the value for Canadians, fully get the value for workers, fully get the value in terms of tax revenues. A lot of the stuff that came in with Trudeau is still around. And yes, Carney has rolled back a lot of stuff, but there's still that incoherent through line between, on one hand, we're an energy producer, and on the other hand, we have policies that no other energy producer has.
Well, I hear that line a lot. The idea that we have policies that no other energy producer has. It rubs me the wrong way for two reasons. One, it's not true. Norway has much more stringent climate policies, carbon taxation, upstream taxes. I mean, my God, if we proposed anything even remotely close to what Norway does to its oil sector, we would be accused of being communists. But it also ignores the fact that we're not supposed to be comparing ourselves to the Saudi Arabias of the world, the OPECs of the world. I thought we were the ethical oil producer. How can we have it both ways when, on the one hand, we take credit for all the things that federal governments have done around LGBTQ rights, around environmental policy, around carbon taxes, but then in the other breath say, but these policies don't get put on any other oil producer. Like, you can't compare us to Iran, Venezuela, what have you, and then sort of reverse the comparison and say, but we're better than those guys. Like we deserve all the credit in the world for these policies. Like, it just feels inconsistent to me.
Well, I mean, look, I wouldn't bundle them. First of all, like I think there's a big difference between being a place that is well, as my mother, who is an immigrant, would say, very tolerant country. Canada's a very tolerant country, but Canadians don't consider it just tolerance. It's inclusivity, and like those are values that are really important to me. So I wouldn't put into the same barrel of hey, I don't love this. Policies on certain climate policies that I think we're just shooting ourselves in the foot. I wouldn't put into that same barrel things like protecting LGBTQ rights or believing that women are people equal to men. I think those are very distinct things. And yeah, we are an ethical oil producer. We have workers who get fairly compensated, more than fairly compensated, who work in these sectors. So the wages are actually far in excess of the average Canadian workers in other sectors. So they bump up everyone's average. We have labor standards. Safety is just like an industry obsession, like anyone in trades, obviously, fears that there's going to be an accident at work. And there's been a huge focus, not only in oil and gas, but in mining and in forestry, making it every year safer and safer. So those are all things I think we should concede on. Labor standards, I think local ecological protection is important to Canadians, and I see it myself as pretty important. Balancing with the fact that we are a civilization, and the nature of civilizations is, it's not a utopia where we consume material goods that enable us to live, and there's zero impact to the environment. That's not a real scenario. We actually have to constantly evaluate that trade-off. And emissions are an aspect of it too. So I think I reject a little bit the premise of what you're saying. That's in order for us to be an ethical producer and to be different, we necessarily need to just throw the baby out with the bathwater. I don't think we should be Saudi Arabia, but I think Australia is another peer competitor in many things that we like to do, critical minerals, natural gas. And Australia is like Canada, historically, tied to the Commonwealth, historically populated, at least initially, in numbers by people coming from the British Isles. And, a lot of their political culture is very similar. I think they're a little different to us in other respects, but, they are often seen by investors that I speak to as a more competitive investment jurisdiction in the types of commodities and production that we're talking about, because they've weighted different values in what they want. And I don't know, I think there's ways that we can have it. And at present, I don't think we're fully leveraging that potential that we have. And Canadians are struggling. That's the other piece. Like, I think our economy, our productivity is going down, and I'm not happy seeing that. And to me, it's a no-brainer that given these massive resources that we have at our disposal, we should be fully Canadians.
We'll get into that in a sec before we wrap here, but I want to get into just a little bit of history of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, because we were both, I'm a British Columbian, you live in British Columbia. We're both intimately familiar with that project. You wrote in your column, the Liberals claimed transformative climate leadership defined by making it as difficult and costly as possible to grow oil and gas. And agree to disagree there. But while professing such devotion to the sector that they invested massively to keep this one project afloat, federal policy failures nearly tortured the Trans Mountain expansion to death. Can you explain which federal policy failures tortured that project to death? Because my recollection is that it was the Horgan NDP government that did the torturing there. I mean, there's even a Financial Post piece from 2018 that was titled "How a Recalcitrant BC Government Forced Kinder Morgan to Sell Trans Mountain to Ottawa." And I don't think anyone thinks of the Financial Post as a pro-liberal publication. So, like, which federal policies tortured Trans Mountain to death?
I think a variety of things. I think what I meant specifically on that line, and like, rhetorical craft is crafty, right? Like, I think the main thing for me in that was the setup of the NEB, and that's not a liberal fuck up, actually. Oh,
That
sorry.
was that was assessed under the Harper era regulations.
That's right. That's right. I think it's actually and Carney's repeating the same mistakes, by the way. Like this is not when I criticize Carney for this. I have like I have my own personal like political views, like being a former liberal, but I'm particularly annoyed at Carney because on one hand he is claiming that he's revolutionizing things. At least that's the message that's being sold. Your listenership in a likelihood sees him as going in and beating things up with a sledgehammer, and oh my goodness, this guy's like really reversing course on the stuff we care about. Totally understandable, right? But despite the talk, I don't actually see the action, and it goes to me principally to the setup of the regulatory environment. It is federal government's responsibility, conservative, liberal again, that we have just a non-functional regulatory system where political interference is literally preserved as an inherent characteristic of that system. It's bizarre. It really shouldn't be the case, in my view, that governments are having to apply sort of political calculus analysis to it rather than letting it be a technocratic decision, and that where you empower regulators to actually decide based on clear parameters. And if there's a limit to the number of projects, or a limit to the production of a thing, having that baked into the regulatory system at the outset should be the course of action, rather than having it all kind of tick certain technical boxes, and then the final decision on whether you go or don't go going up to governor and council, which is cabinet. And that's principally the nature of the federal policy failures. It's other aspects around the broader NAB process. It's how Indigenous consultation had to be redone. Of course, there was things evolving rapidly in that time period. I work a lot in reconciliation. I've spent a lot of time working with nations who have been involved in major projects. And, that time period was particularly one where a lot of nations were gaining a political and sort of legal sophistication that for many of them was new. There were others who, for decades been very, very legally sophisticated. But I think in terms of involvement in regulatory processes, really started to see that kick off around that period. And Trans Mountain was a case for that. So that had to be redone. The courts found it was deficient. I think part of why it was deficient is because it wasn't set up by the federal government that did set it up in the right way that it should have been. But the responsibility ultimately rests with anyone who is not aware present. Like every cycle, everyone likes to blame who was there before. I know there's a limited amount of political capital that can be spent on fixing anything, but I do find it very frustrating that the same issues in the regulatory process keep cropping up. And even as, Carney has come in with changes to it, it's still preserving a lot of the stuff that's broken. And now we have a fast tracking process that admits that the whole thing is broken. It's so broken that we need to fast track projects is essentially the nature of the admission in my view. So anyways, I hope that answered your question. I know it's a sort of roundabout answer, but got me thinking
Well,
about a couple of things.
I do want to put a pin in the fact that it was the Harper government that sort of introduced the political gate in the regulatory process. They were the ones who brought cabinet into that sort of very prominent role. They gave cabinet the veto that was then sort of that became a problem when it was a different government that wielded the veto. So my 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 complaint here, my issue here, my bone to pick here is just that let's be honest about the things that actually happened in the past, right? It's not just reflexively blaming previous governments. There's lots of things the Harper government got right. There's lots of things the Trudeau government got wrong. But on Trans Mountain, it wasn't the Trudeau government that made the mess. It was the Trudeau government that cleaned it up. Maybe not as efficiently or cost effectively as we would like, but it frustrates me that that gets obscured in the discourse.
Think it's a reasonable frustration. What I was thinking when I wrote that was the numerous debates I had with our mutual friends, numerous debates I had with other folks who are former candidates or present MPs, and all of them, knowing that I was at that point studying energy policy, then in the energy policy space, would say to me, "But we bought the pipeline. Like we're faultless. We bought the pipeline. We're so great." And I think the stuff that went wrong for Trans Mountain was complex. Like there were in general, like I'm trying to sort of roll back the clock here in my head. Was the Tech Frontier decision, was that before or after?
It was
It
after.
was after.
Yeah,
Trying to roll back a little bit further. Yeah, because there's a series of and I'm trying to also recall because yeah, I'd already started working in this space, and the folks that I was speaking to in Calgary at that point, being far more, I guess it's been a decade now, far more junior in my career, were generally very pessimistic about what was possible. And then when Kinder Morgan said that they were proceeding with it, I believe, yeah, the provincial environment was part of it, but the vibes coming from Ottawa, no doubt, in my view, had a big part to play in the decision. So I don't
okay.
know. That's my general impression, and I think overall we see those competitive impacts continue.
I mean, my experience with the folks in Calgary is that they are not always the best indicators of what's actually happening. I mean, the vibes being what they were, the federal government made it clear when it announced basically the decision to accept the federal court's ruling on Gateway that it was going to make sure TMX happened because it was sort of giving ground on Gateway. So I remember there was a very famous speech that Ian Anderson, sort of then CEO, gave at the Petroleum Club, and this would have been back in 2013 or 2014, where he said the Harper government and the way it talked about pipelines was it needed to be quiet because it was damaging the public consensus around the issue by being so militant and so sort of heavy-handed about it. So it's ancient history at this point, but let's sort of look to the future. Let's imagine that we can fix the regulatory system. We get whatever government in place, and they design a perfect regulatory system. It does it still, do pipelines or projects get approved and permitted and built in 6 months? I've seen conservative politicians sort of looking longingly at this pipeline in the UAE that's being built across the desert. And it's being built in 6 months, and they're saying, well, why can't we do that here? And my point is, well, British Columbia is filled with complications, particularly legal complications, geographical complications. I guess my question is there ever a situation where it's easy to build something through BC, or is that just the nature of the place?
I love this question. I think it's a great one. I think just generally, like I love to think about what is an optimal setup. What would the conditions in place have to be for unicorns to fly and for rainbows? Obviously, nonsensical, but it's good to think about in the context of what is the ideal regulatory system. And then you come up on natural, geographic, physical limitations. You also come up against political limitations, and I agree with you. BC is not an easy place. Um, I think part of my overall, I guess, assessment, having grown up in British Columbia, I was born in Vancouver, having gone to school here. I remember when no Enbridge was what kids were putting in their middle names on Facebook. That was like a whole thing. Being, edgy and kind of a shit disturber, I deliberately put yes, Enbridge. This is before I even had an opinion on pipelines. I was just agent provocateur, and I want to see the reaction. And the reaction was so good, I bad that I actually was like, "Hey, wait a minute. I don't think this Enbridge thing is so bad." That gave me a little bit
Yeah.
of a foundation when I started getting into the resource stuff. Well, and I should say that Enbridge in particular, I think made it difficult for the energy sector to rebuild trust. I think in the last 10, 15 years, they've actually rebuilt that trust really well.
Hmm.
And it's one that people in industry look back on and they say, yeah, Northern Gateway, we learned a lot of things about how to do it and not to do it. And I think that process of rebuilding trust is never a binary. There's communities in BC that are still very opposed to anything to do with pipelines. I think we've seen a lot of progress in natural gas, and the natural gas midstream proponents have done, I think, a really, really good job building trust. Coastal GasLink, had its, protests and people were not always happy with it, but they got the project done without anything, bad happening. There was, I think, a lot of learnings that went in from sort of that combo of Coastal GasLink and LNG Canada. Um, I think as time goes on, we're actually going to get better at this because to get back to the regulatory system that we have had for a very long time is very gamifiable. And I think my longstanding thesis on this has been it's partially by design. Governments have wanted to avoid the difficult balancing act of having to choose between climate and choose between energy exports. So rather than take a firm position, and this is something I've spoken to my friend Marla Ornstein, who used to be at the Canada West Foundation. She's doing other stuff now. She started out in regulatory systems. I think it was in pharmaceuticals and like human health and safety. She moved into energy, did a number of really cool studies for Canada West on this. And she sort of gave me this way of thinking about it along the lines of the the regulatory process and all the different steps involved have sort of become a proxy for the stuff that should be happening at the political level. And I think it's essentially what we saw play out with Trans Mountain, where groups that were opposed to the project because of climate concerns really leveraged local issues to the maximum degree. Like there was, people out there with binoculars, like on top of the ones that the project had, watching for wildlife, like looking for
Oh yeah.
every little bumblebee, looking for every little hummingbird, and turning every little thing into a problem. So when people are using a process that is built for something else as a way to get around a decision going forward that they're not happy with, if your process is prone to that, I don't think you're actually honoring the intent of that process, and it's not a high integrity process. And that's on the opponents to projects, gamifying projects side. I think on the flip side of it, doing things very quickly, if you steamroll over public opinion and you don't give people on the ground, people who have strong opinions elsewhere, a chance to voice those opinions in a way that they think is fair, you're not actually going to be able to build and maintain that trust. So I think we need to get that balance. I don't think we're going to get things done like the UAE. We're certainly not pretending there are no opponents because a lot of countries they do that. And they steamroll over opposition. They don't value democratic participation. They don't value fairness and justice and rule of law. We do value those things as Canadians, and I think they're inherent to why we have regulatory processes at all that invite public participation. But I also think that we need to get better at actually setting a goal and setting a mandate at the outset, and making it clear that participation and the gamification of participation pathways is not a way to obstruct or to delay if a decision has already been made. And it shouldn't be that way, because if a democratically elected government says, well, if they're giving themselves the power to thumbs up or thumbs down a project, if they've said yes, we're doing this, that decision should be binding. It should be one that constantly gets caught up in a bazillion different obstructionist tactics. And then conversely, if the decision is no, industry does respect that. Opponents often don't. So that's where I think we need to find a balance and maintain that trust within it.
Yeah, I think getting rid of the gamification of the regulatory system um, is a good way of putting it. Would be a good goal. I'm fairly certain that the Carney government will at some point redo the Impact Assessment Act, and that would probably be a good course to take. I would just caution people in industry, and of course they always listen to me. But you're never going to get the sort of frictionless, clean, predictable process that they want, right? They want to be able to put an application in place, have it heard, have it adjudicated, and start construction within months. And that's just not how it works in this country, and it never will be. And I think if we sort of embrace the complexity of our country and understand that it's going to be a little harder here than Texas, we're more likely to be successful in whatever it is we're trying to accomplish. Last question, because we're running up on time here. I've made my views about the new pipeline that was announced to the West Coast, or I guess the southwest coast clear. I don't think industry will step up with the barrels that are needed to fill that pipeline. And so I think that will ultimately be its death knell. There's all sorts of data coming out now that shows that we're sort of suddenly in a market glut, and OPEC is probably going to do the market share thing it did back in 2014, 2015. Where do you land on whether this pipeline actually gets built, and more importantly, whether it gets filled with new barrels?
That's a good one. I haven't looked at the shippers case much recently. I've been looking more at the route choice, and yeah, no, there's a lot to unpack within that. I just filed an op-ed in the National Post. Might be out by the time this podcast comes out. Looking at what I think the investability case is. And essentially my read on it is if a private proponent doesn't come up, we have a problem. And I think same goes for the shippers piece. I think it's, to your point about a market glut, I think it's possible. These decisions aren't made in a short-term sense, though. Like, if we are at capacity on our exports, everything that I have heard suggests that more egress is still wanted and needed. There isn't that demand hasn't, dematerialized because of short-term commodity cycles perhaps not being as lovely. Yeah, and I don't think that's the way this decision is typically made. I expect shippers will come through for the reason that the egress problem hasn't gone away, and there's still demand to increase production in the long term, over a long-term horizon, and there's demand to increase export. I think the geopolitics of it are also particularly pertinent here. While we have this leverage with the US, I think we want to continue to sell them that energy, but they are actively soliciting growing Venezuelan crude oil as I think as a replacement to Canada functionally, because the refineries need heavy crude. And then there's also the proponent of the pipeline itself. And I wouldn't want to see another pipeline that's backstopped by taxpayers. I think that would be an indictment of investability and confidence. So if the right parameters are set out where a proponent has a sense of, okay, this isn't going to be another, pain in the ass Trans Mountain 2.0 experience, then I think a proponent will actually be interested because it is a project that can and should be profitable. And then conversely, if we don't see that, I'm going to continue to have doubts about our overall investability as a country.
let's say the federal government and the provincial government of Alberta offer to basically backstop cost overruns. So it
Mhm.
says to a private proponent, you model what it should cost to build this pipeline. Anything above 10% cost overruns, we'll cover as sort of the backstop. Is that still an indictment of our ability to attract investment and serve as a country, or is that just an acknowledgement of the reality on the ground? I mean, um, the Coastal GasLink pipeline was not built by the government. It came in way over budget. That may just be what it looks like to build a pipeline through BC.
It depends on what the nature of the overruns is, right? Like, if it's protest and it's your inability or unwillingness to deal with that protest, and to actually, even if it's like midway, like reform the process to get rid of some this gamification. We were talking about this earlier. Like, I heard functionally the same story. The energy space in BC is not very massive, and someone's worked on a major project. I've spoken to a few people there at least. I've heard virtually identical stories on Trans Mountain and Coastal GasLink around the timing of certain protest activities, seasonal windows, or oh, this section must be completed before things get mucky over here, or this freezes over here, and the combination of illegal protest activities, in some cases, uh, legal challenges or attempts to do that, uh, gamification of wildlife and conservation legislation. Uh, all of that is a really substantial part of these cost overruns. I don't know what percentage. I haven't looked at it in detail. I'm not sure I would have access to that data, but it even if anecdotally, it strikes me as a pretty significant source of overruns. That these aren't like commercial issues; these aren't just labor sourcing issues. I'm sure some of it is that too. All major industries in this country who need skilled labor struggle to get skilled labor when they need it, the amount that they need affordably. So
Mm.
cost overruns on things like bridges, they come with the territory. So sure, I think those things are reasonable. But if governments are willing to acknowledge. We will do our very best to fix this problem. And if we fail to do that, we will be responsible for our failure to maintain a reasonable working environment around you building this project. I think that would be a reasonable concession to make to make it possible. But I would hope that wouldn't just become, I think we just keep paying money for. Both literally paying money out of taxpayers' pockets, but then also paying in the sense that we lose out through delay, through uncertainty, through failure to fix the underlying issues on investment that could materialize. And in that sense, we pay the price because of missed out opportunities. So I think in a lot of ways we have a lot of work to do as a country to address those kinds of things and get out of our own ways so we're not constantly running up into these challenges and saying, oh, that's just the way it is. Like that's normal. It's not normal. And I think we can be a democracy with, right to public participation and consultation and input without also setting ourselves up for investment failure and investment deterrence, which is what we see when we allow scenarios like that to keep going forward.
Okay. Final question, because I think it just helps give context for the conversation we've had today. 2045, do you think global oil demand is higher or lower than it is today?
That's a good question. I don't actually know. Yeah, I've looked at a lot of scenarios, and I think we're seeing a rollback on some scenarios that were proposed. And I think it's important to note as well. So I studied climate policy in 2018, 2019. I did my master's at University College London. The guy who taught me sort of my stream specifically was one of sort of the leads on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. So they would do these reports. Sort of paired with the UN FCCC process. And at that time, it was already apparent to the climate scientists and the policy experts that the pathways to mitigation that were being put out were largely unachievable. And there's a clear difference between if you want to avoid the very worst of climate change, this is what you need to do, versus this is what markets are actually going to do. And also, reliability of commitments matters. So there was a sort of a chunk of time where governments, including Canada, were in over their skis, making commitments that now many people are back saying, like, I'm actually not so sure that this is achievable, this is possible. So the question that you've asked, I think, cuts to the heart of that uncertainty. The US rolling back under Trump, a lot of its commitments to climate action, I think, is a really big part of this. World's largest economy, a lot of signals that the US sends, they get picked up and replicated by other major players. I think it's very likely that we're not going to see a huge reduction in the use of fossil fuels. And I think that even if we are seeing a reduction in the increased use of it, energy is being added. And we've seen over the last decade an energy addition, not an energy transition. The world still runs on fossil fuels. I don't think that's changing anytime soon. I think the mix is changing a little bit. I think we're seeing more natural gas, a little bit less coal over time, increasingly less, one would hope. But I don't think fossil fuels are going away.
I will take the other side of that argument and that bet, but we do not have time to indulge it today, so maybe we'll save it for another time. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for your time, Max. This is great.